December 27, 2016. Two men stumble out of an apartment building in Krasnogorsk, a Moscow suburb, their pockets bulging with the most pathetic haul imaginable for criminals of their supposed stature. 20,000 rubles, a cheap Chaika watch, and a bottle of cognac, stolen from a 75-year-old woman's home. Police officers waiting outside immediately surround them. During the search, investigators find not just the stolen items, but professional lock-picking tools. One of the detained men is 34 years old, covered in prison tattoos that supposedly mark him as a thief in law, the highest rank in the Russian criminal hierarchy. His name is Besik Kvinikidze, but in the underworld, he goes by Beso Rustavsky. This wasn't his first arrest. It wouldn't be his last. But the sheer absurdity of this particular crime, a supposed crime boss breaking into a grandmother's apartment for a bottle of alcohol, perfectly captured the bizarre trajectory of a man who spent his entire life desperately grasping for criminal authority he could never truly hold. The story of Beso Rustavsky isn't one of criminal genius or strategic brilliance. It's a tale of relentless ambition colliding with constant failure, of lies piled upon lies until the entire structure collapsed. Born Besik Zorabovich Kvinikidze on September 21, 1982, in Neryungry, a remote city in the Yakutia region of Russia, he entered a world where crime was the family business. His father, Zurab Kvinikidze, was himself a criminal authority, ensuring that young Besik absorbed what some romanticize as thieves' culture from his earliest years. But there was nothing romantic about it. Growing up in a household devoid of legitimate moral guidance, where quick money and street reputation mattered more than education or honest work, Besik learned only one path forward, the criminal one. From childhood, he engaged in petty hooliganism that gradually escalated. Without legitimate role models or stable foundations, he gravitated toward the very world that had defined his father's existence. The absence of proper parental guidance, combined with the allure of easy money and the twisted prestige of criminal life, set him on an inevitable collision course with law enforcement. By his teenage years, local authorities in Moscow had already taken notice of this young troublemaker from Yakutia, who seemed determined to make a name for himself in the capital's criminal landscape. The first major crime that would define his trajectory came when Besik was just 17 years old. In 1999, he was detained by officers from the Sokolnaya Gora Police Department in Moscow for one of the most serious charges imaginable, holding people hostage and demanding ransom money. The incident occurred at a cafe called Piv Bar on Old Arbat Street, one of Moscow's historic and touristy areas. The details of exactly how a 17-year-old managed to pull off such an operation remain murky, but the consequences were crystal clear. Despite his youth, the Russian justice system showed no leniency. Prosecutors pushed for the maximum penalty, and judges agreed. Representatives of Russian Themis, as the legal system is sometimes called, convicted him with full severity, sentencing him to several years in prison. For most young people, such a harsh early sentence might serve as a wake-up call, a chance to reconsider life choices before it's too late. For Besik, prison became a university of crime. Behind bars, he didn't learn legitimate skills or plan for a law-abiding future. Instead, he immersed himself deeper into criminal culture, building connections with other inmates, learning the supposed code of thieves, and cultivating his image as someone destined for higher status in the underworld hierarchy. The prison system, rather than rehabilitating him, simply reinforced everything his upbringing had already taught him. Upon his release, Besik didn't even pretend to attempt a normal life. Almost immediately after regaining his freedom, on September 23, 2004, he committed his second major documented crime, attempting to steal a Jeep Grand Cherokee. The choice of vehicle suggested someone trying to maintain appearances, to project an image of success despite having no legitimate means of achieving it. He was caught, arrested, and the wheels of justice began turning once again. This time, the legal proceedings dragged on for years. It wasn't until March 1, 2007, that the Mshansky Court of Moscow finally delivered its verdict. 8 years of imprisonment under Article 158 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation. Theft. 8 years is a significant chunk of anyone's life, especially for someone in their 20s. Besik entered prison in his early 20s and would emerge in his early 30s, having spent what should have been his most productive years behind bars. But he didn't see it as wasted time. In the twisted logic of the criminal world, prison time carried its own currency. The longer you served, the more legitimate your criminal credentials became. Time behind bars meant you were serious, committed to the life, not just some amateur playing at crime. And Besik had grand ambitions. He wanted to become a thief in law, a vor v zakon, the elite rank of the Russian criminal hierarchy. The concept of thief in law has deep historical roots in Soviet-era prison camps, where certain inmates claimed to live by a strict code that supposedly governed their behavior. In theory, these laws included refusing to work for the state, rejecting family ties, and maintaining absolute loyalty to the criminal world. In practice, the title had become more about power, connections, and the ability to control criminal operations, both inside and outside prison walls. Being crowned a thief-in-law meant you could settle disputes, collect tribute, and command respect across the entire criminal network. For someone like Besik, who had grown up hearing stories of his father's criminal exploits, achieving this status represented the ultimate validation. Being cut off from the obshak wasn't just a financial penalty. It was a public declaration that you were no longer part of the inner circle, that you had violated the code and were being sanctioned for it. For someone with ambitions of becoming a thief-in-law himself, this should have been career-ending. But Besik was cunning, if nothing else. He understood that the Butyrka incident would destroy any chance of being crowned if the right people knew about it. So, he simply decided not to tell them. As the years passed and he completed his 8-year sentence, he began lobbying for recognition as a thief-in-law. He presented himself as a career criminal who had done serious time, who understood the traditions, who deserved the crown. And crucially, he omitted any mention of what had happened with Guja Kutaisi in Butyrka. This wasn't just a minor oversight, it was deliberate fraud, lying to the very authorities who would decide his status. In June 2013, at the age of 30, Besik Kvinikidze achieved what had seemed impossible just years earlier. He was formally crowned as a thief-in-law in a ceremony that involved several influential criminal authorities. The coronation was sponsored by heavy hitters in the criminal world: Georgy Sorokin, known as Zhora Tashkent, Ali Gaydarov, called Albert Rigi, Georgy Janalizde, nicknamed Gogi Pitersky, Sachino Gegechkori, and Mamuka Chikadwa, referred to as Mamuka Galsky. These weren't random criminals. They were established thieves-in-law with significant influence. Their endorsement should have made Besik's status unquestionable. The coronation represented the pinnacle of everything Besik had worked toward his entire adult life. Now, he could call himself Beso Rustavsky, a thief-in-law with all the authority and respect that supposedly came with the title. He could settle disputes among criminals, collect tribute from criminal operations, and speak with the weight of the criminal hierarchy behind him. For someone who had grown up in a criminal household, who had spent years in prison building toward this moment, it must have seemed like ultimate victory. He had achieved what his father had achieved. He had proven himself. Or so he thought. But the lie at the foundation of his coronation was a ticking time bomb. In the criminal world, information spreads slowly but surely. Inmates transfer between facilities, guards get bribed to pass messages, and eventually, someone always talks. It was only a matter of time before the truth about Butyrka reached the ears of people who mattered, and when it did, the consequences would be devastating. Besik had built his criminal authority on deception, and deception, ironically, is supposed to be one of the worst violations of the thieves' code that prizes honesty among thieves, however hypocritical that concept might be. For a few years, however, he enjoyed his status. As a crowned thief-in-law, he had authority in prison and influence outside. Other criminals had to respect his decisions, defer to his judgment, and contribute to the upshak when he demanded it. He got the tattoos that marked his status, elaborate designs that, in the prison world, serve as a kind of criminal resume, advertising your rank and achievements to anyone who can read the symbols. These tattoos covered his body, permanent declarations of his criminal identity that would later serve as evidence against him in court. But Besik's fundamental character flaws, the dishonesty, the shortcuts, the willingness to lie even to his supposed allies, meant that his time at the top would be short-lived. He continued engaging in criminal activity, accumulating more charges, more prison time. In 2014, authorities detained him in Klin on suspicion of involvement in a violent robbery of a store in northern Moscow, where approximately 6 million rubles were stolen. The details of this crime added another entry to his growing criminal record, another conviction to add to the list. Then came the incident that perfectly encapsulated the gap between Besik's pretensions and his reality. After being released from his sentence for illegal weapons possession, he'd been convicted under Article 222 of the Criminal Code and served 2 years, getting out on June 29, 2016. He immediately returned to Moscow's suburbs. At 34 years old, supposedly a thief-in-law commanding respect and authority, he did something almost incomprehensibly petty. He and a 39-year-old accomplice broke into the apartment of a 75-year-old woman in Krasnogorsk and stole items worth almost nothing. The target was an elderly woman living alone in a building on Ilynskoye Highway. Besik and his partner ransacked her home, turning everything upside down, desperately searching for valuables. Their total haul? 20,500 rubles, roughly $350 at the time. A Chaika brand watch that was worth maybe a few thousand rubles at most, and a single bottle of cognac. For someone who supposedly occupied the highest position in the criminal hierarchy, who could theoretically organize major criminal operations and collect tribute from serious criminals, this was humiliating. This was the work of desperate street criminals, not elite criminal authorities. Police caught them essentially red-handed. As Besik and his accomplice exited the building, officers were waiting. During the personal search, investigators found not just the stolen items, but also a set of professional lock-picking tools, proof that they'd come prepared to break into apartments. There was no way to talk their way out of this one. The evidence was overwhelming, and the crime itself was so petty that it made national news, not because it was serious, but because it was pathetic. Headlines across Russia mocked the supposed thief-in-law who got caught stealing cognac from a grandmother. The arrest on December 27, 2016, should have been a moment of reflection. Here was a man in his mid-30s, already facing his 4th major conviction, caught committing the kind of small-time burglary that even beginning criminals would consider beneath them. But for Besik, it was just another setback in a life defined by poor decisions and short-term thinking. He was charged under Article 158 of the Criminal Code, theft, and faced years in prison once again. The Krasnogorsk court, presided over by Judge Sergei Vasilyevich Shapovalov, convicted him and sentenced him to 2.5 years in a strict regime colony. 2.5 years might not seem like much compared to his earlier 8-year sentence, but this conviction was particularly damaging to his reputation. In June 2018, barely a year and a half into his sentence, police caught him involved in yet another burglary attempt. Officers from the Moscow Regional Police Department's Criminal Investigation Unit, working with colleagues from the Krasnogorsk district, detained 2 previously convicted local residents aged 39 and 34, the latter being Besik, on suspicion of committing another apartment burglary. The pattern was unmistakable. Even while supposedly being a thief-in-law, he was engaging in petty crimes that suggested either desperation or complete lack of judgment. These arrests and convictions were happening against a backdrop of increasing scrutiny of thieves-in-law throughout Russia. For decades, authorities had struggled to prosecute these criminal elites effectively. You could charge them with individual crimes, theft, assault, extortion, but proving their role as criminal authorities was difficult. They rarely got their hands dirty with direct criminal acts, instead orchestrating operations through subordinates. Prosecutors needed a new approach, a law that specifically targeted the status itself rather than individual criminal acts. That law came in April 2019, when Russia introduced Article 210.1 of the Criminal Code, occupying the highest position in criminal hierarchy. This new legislation made it a crime simply to be a thief-in-law, to hold that status and wield that authority. Penalties ranged from 8 to 15 years in prison, with substantial fines up to 5 million rubles. For the first time, prosecutors could target criminal authorities not for what they did, but for who they were and the position they held in the criminal world. The introduction of this law would have devastating consequences for Besik. But first, his criminal status itself was about to face a more traditional challenge. By 2019, the truth about the Butyrka incident had finally caught up with him. Information about what had really happened in 2006, the confrontation in front of guards, the beating from Guja Kutaisi, the removal from the Obshchak, had spread throughout the criminal world. More importantly, influential thieves-in-law now understood that Besik had lied during his coronation ceremony. He had committed fraud against the very system he claimed to respect. The response was inevitable. On May 6, 2019, his status as a thief-in-law was formally suspended. After 6 years of claiming the crown, Besik was stripped of his title in a process called discoronation. The authorities who had crowned him in 2013 now declared that the coronation had been invalid because it was based on deception. For someone who had spent 6 years basking in the supposed glory of being a thief-in-law, the discoronation was catastrophic. Being stripped of the title meant more than just losing prestige. It meant public humiliation. Everyone in the criminal world would know he'd been exposed as a fraud, someone who had lied to achieve status he didn't deserve. The very criminals he'd been giving orders to, collecting money from, and claiming authority over now knew the truth. Worse, he had no one to blame but himself. If he'd been honest about Butyrka from the beginning, if he'd worked to resolve the conflict with Guja Kutaisi as he was supposed to, he might have eventually earned legitimate recognition. Instead, his dishonesty had poisoned everything. The discoronation came with instructions. Thieves-in-law who had reviewed his case didn't permanently ban him from ever achieving the status. They gave him a chance at redemption. To restore his position, he needed to resolve the original conflict with Guja Kutaisi. This meant acknowledging what had happened, making amends according to criminal world protocols, and getting Guja's forgiveness, or at least acknowledgement that the matter was settled. It wouldn't be easy, especially since years had passed, but it was theoretically possible. Besik, however, failed to do even this. He didn't resolve the conflict within the time frame given. Whether due to pride, inability to locate Guja, or simple incompetence, he let the opportunity slip away. The result was predictable. Without his thief-in-law status, Besik became just another convicted criminal serving time in Russia's brutal prison system. He completed his sentence for the Krasnogorsk burglary, getting out in June 2020. But unlike his earlier releases, this time law enforcement was waiting with something new: criminal charges under the freshly enacted Article 210.1. Investigators from the main directorate of the Ministry of Internal Affairs for Saratov region had been building a case, documenting his activities while in prison, gathering evidence that he had continued to act as a thief-in-law even after his official discoronation. Instead of walking free, Besik was immediately transferred to SIZO 1, the pretrial detention center in Saratov. The timing was deliberate and devastating. After serving years for the grandmother's cognac bottle, he had perhaps expected to finally have some time outside prison walls. Instead, he found himself facing potentially 15 more years under the new law that specifically criminalized his claimed status. The charges alleged that from April 2019 until September 8, 2020, while imprisoned in colonies in Saratov and Chelyabinsk regions, he had occupied the highest position in criminal hierarchy despite knowing it was now a criminal offense. But the story of how Besik ended up facing these charges involves one of the most bizarre episodes in his entire criminal career, an attempt to reclaim his thief-in-law status through what can only be described as an elaborate disinformation campaign. While serving time in Saratov colony in early 2019, Besik apparently decided that he couldn't accept being just an ordinary convict. He wanted his crown back, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get it, including fabricating an entirely fictional narrative about his accomplishments in prison. The campaign began with letters. In 2019, while Besik was incarcerated in a Saratov region correctional facility, several established thieves-in-law received messages asking them to recognize Besik Kvinikidze as a legitimate thief-in-law. These weren't random requests. They came with elaborate justifications. The letters claimed that Besik had accomplished something remarkable during his imprisonment. He had single-handedly unfrozen the Saratov prison system and established proper thieves' order in what had allegedly been a nightmarish facility where inmates were systematically abused, raped, and murdered by prison administration. According to this narrative, Besik had arrived at a red prison, criminal slang for a facility completely controlled by administration rather than by inmates following criminal traditions, and through sheer force of personality and criminal authority had transformed it into a black zone where traditional criminal hierarchy prevailed. He supposedly organized the inmates, stood up to corrupt guards, protected vulnerable prisoners from sexual violence, and created a system where the thieves' code governed daily life, rather than arbitrary brutality from guards. If true, these would have been extraordinary accomplishments, worthy of recognition, and possibly reinstatement. The problem was that virtually none of it was true. Besik had appropriated someone else's genuine achievements and claimed them as his own. The actual person who had worked to change conditions in Saratov prisons was another criminal named Irakli Danelia, a thief-in-law who was serving time in Balashov prison. Danelia had legitimately confronted prison administration, organized resistance to abuses, and helped establish better conditions for inmates. These were real accomplishments that other criminals could verify. Besik simply heard about these events and decided to pretend he'd done them himself. But some influential criminals were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, at least initially. The key figure in Besik's attempted comeback was Shalva Osmanov, known in criminal circles as Kusya, who was approximately 33 years old and happened to be the great-nephew of Zahari Kalashov, Shako Molodoy, one of the most powerful thieves-in-law in Russia before his arrest. Kusya's connection to Shako gave him significant influence, but his own position had become precarious after his famous relative was sentenced to nearly 10 years in prison. Looking for allies and support, Kusya became receptive to Besik's claims. Besik apparently convinced Kusya that he deserved a second chance, that his supposed accomplishments in Saratov demonstrated his commitment to criminal traditions despite the earlier problems. Kusya, calculating that supporting Besik might earn him a loyal ally in an increasingly fractured criminal world, began advocating for his reinstatement. But Kusya wasn't the only major criminal who got involved. Nadir Salifov, known as Lotuguli, an influential Azerbaijani thief-in-law who controlled criminal operations in Yekaterinburg and Chelyabinsk, also expressed support for Besik's reinstatement. Lotuguli was impressed by the stories about Besik's alleged prison reforms. As someone who valued maintaining criminal traditions and protecting inmates from state abuse, Guli saw Besik's supposed accomplishments as exactly the kind of behavior that should be rewarded. If Besik had really transformed a red zone into a black one, if he'd really protected vulnerable prisoners and established thieves' order against administration opposition, then he deserved not just forgiveness, but celebration. The fact that these accomplishments were largely fictional didn't immediately become apparent. In 2019, messages began circulating through Russia's prison system stating that influential thieves-in-law had decided to restore Besik's status. Letters arrived at Saratov colony where he was held, bearing names like Makare Gvaramia, Matsik, Niko Jibuadze, Nika Gagrinsky, and others, all supposedly confirming that Besik Kvinikidze was once again recognized as Beso Rustavsky, thief-in-law. For someone who had been publicly disgraced and stripped of his crown, this must have seemed like miraculous redemption. Not only was his status restored, but it appeared to have the backing of some of the most powerful criminals in the Russian underworld. Besik, however, couldn't just accept this victory quietly. True to his character, he had to brag about it, to make sure everyone knew of his triumph. He began recording audio messages on smuggled mobile phones, a common contraband item in Russian prisons despite supposed security measures, and distributing them throughout the prison system. In these recordings, he announced that Sheko and Guli had personally intervened to resolve his situation, that he was now officially with his own, meaning restored to full thief-in-law status with all accompanying privileges and authority. These audio messages spread rapidly through prison networks. Inmates pass information through various channels: messages hidden in packages, codes and letters, brief conversations during transfers, and increasingly through contraband phones. Within weeks, prisoners across multiple facilities knew that Beso Rustavsky was claiming his crown had been restored with the blessing of major criminal authorities. For Besik, this publicity served multiple purposes. It reinforced his claimed status, warned potential challengers that he had powerful backing, and allowed him to reassert authority over other inmates. But the audio messages also created problems. Not everyone in the criminal world was convinced that Besik deserved reinstatement, and his boastful announcements rubbed some powerful people the wrong way. One of those people was Eduard Asatrian, known as Osetrina or Osetrinka, another influential criminal authority. Asatrian was skeptical of Besik's claimed accomplishments and annoyed by the presumptuous way he was announcing his supposed restoration. This skepticism triggered a confrontation that would expose the entire fraud. The conflict came to a head in a conversation between Lotu Guli and Eduard Asatrian that was later described by sources in the criminal world. Guli, advocating for Besik, made an impassioned argument. He pointed out that if Besik had really accomplished what he claimed in Saratov, reforming the prison system, protecting inmates, establishing thieves' order, then he deserved support, regardless of past mistakes. Guli even criticized Asatrian for not dealing with another problem, mentioning that Nodari Asoyan, Nodar Rustavsky, had been openly calling Asatrian a cop for 2 years without any response, yet Asatrian still expected to be treated as an equal. Guli's argument was essentially that if someone had done genuine service to the criminal world, as Besik supposedly had, then previous conflicts should be set aside. The criminal world needed people who would stand up to prison administration, who would protect the traditions, who would maintain the code even in the worst conditions. If Besik had really done this single-handedly in Saratov, as claimed, then he should be welcomed back and his previous dishonesty about Butyrka overlooked. Guli concluded that they should give Besik the benefit of the doubt and ask questions later, when they could meet face-to-face after his release. Asatrian was reportedly stunned by this conversation. He admitted that he knew nothing about any heroic accomplishments by Besik in Saratov prisons. This was the first he'd heard of these supposed achievements, and he was one of the people who should have been informed if something that significant had really happened. The fact that this was news to him raised immediate red flags. If Besik had really done what he claimed, other inmates would have been talking about it, word would have spread through proper channels, and multiple sources would have confirmed the story independently. The truth began to emerge when Irakli Danelia, the thief-in-law who was actually imprisoned in Balashov and had actually worked to improve prison conditions, heard about Besik's claims. Danelia revealed that Besik hadn't unfrozen anything and hadn't repainted any prison zones. Besik had simply taken credit for Danelia's own genuine accomplishments. This revelation was devastating because it meant Besik had once again built his status on lies. He'd done exactly what had gotten him discoronated in the first place, fabricated achievements, and deceived the authorities who were supposed to judge his worthiness. But by the time this truth emerged, the situation had become politically complicated. Guli had already publicly advocated for Besik. Kusya had invested his credibility in supporting him. For them to now reverse course and admit they'd been fooled would mean losing face. In the criminal world, where reputation is everything, admitting you've been deceived by an obvious fraud is almost as damaging as being a fraud yourself. The conversation between Guli and Asatryan about Besik had already happened and been discussed widely. Backing down now would make them look weak and gullible. What happened next remains somewhat murky, but according to sources in the criminal world, there was apparently a conversation with Shako Molodoy himself, despite his imprisonment. Shako, the king of a Russian criminal world before his arrest, still wielded enormous influence even from behind bars. When the full details of Besik's deception became clear, that he'd lied about Saratov, just as he'd lied about Butyrka, Shako apparently decided enough was enough. The situation needed to be walked back before it damaged the credibility of everyone involved. Kusya, who had enthusiastically supported Besik's reinstatement, was forced to send a corrective message. In a humiliating reversal, he told Besik that he had misinterpreted the earlier communication. The restoration of his status wasn't as definitive as Besik had assumed. When asked whether Besik had really been spreading those audio messages throughout prison camps, bragging about Shako and Guli's support, Besik denied everything. He claimed he'd never sent such recordings, that someone must have fabricated them, or that it was all a misunderstanding. This denial only made things worse. Multiple inmates across different facilities had heard the audio messages. Guards had likely intercepted some of them. There was no credible way to claim they didn't exist. Besik's reflexive lying, even when caught red-handed, demonstrated exactly why he could never be trusted with genuine authority. The criminal world's informal verdict was damning. Life has taught Beso nothing. He was fundamentally incapable of honesty, even in situations where lying only made things worse. By the end of 2019 and into 2020, Besik's status was in limbo. Some criminals still recognized him as a thief-in-law based on the earlier messages, while others considered him disgraced and fraudulent. This ambiguous position was actually worse than being clearly discoronated, because it meant constant challenges to his authority and ongoing disputes about whether he had the right to collect tribute, settle conflicts, or make decisions affecting other criminals. He was in a kind of criminal purgatory, not fully accepted, not fully rejected. During this entire period, while all the drama about his status unfolded, Besik was continuing to engage in the activities that would eventually land him in court under Article 210.1. Prosecutors would later prove that from April 2019 to September 2020, while imprisoned in Saratov and Chelyabinsk region colonies, he acted as though he occupied the highest position in criminal hierarchy. He collected money from other inmates for the obshchak. He designated certain prisoners as lower in status, while recognizing others as having the right to occupy higher positions. He settled disputes according to supposed thieves' traditions. He instructed inmates to disobey prison administration and deliberately destabilized colony operations. All of this was happening while authorities were building their case. The new Article 210.1 had been specifically designed to target exactly this kind of behavior. Prosecutors didn't need to prove Besik had committed any specific violent crime or major theft. They just needed to demonstrate that he claimed and exercised authority as a thief-in-law, that other inmates recognized this authority, and that he used it to run criminal operations within the prison system. Every time he collected tribute, every time he settled a dispute, every time he gave orders based on his supposed status, he was committing a crime under the new law. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Investigators had testimony from numerous witnesses, other inmates who confirmed that Besik acted as a criminal authority within the prison. They had documentation of money transfers and the Obszczak's operations. They had recordings of his audio messages bragging about his status. And perhaps most damningly, they had his tattoos. The elaborate designs covering his body specifically advertised his status as a thief-in-law. These weren't just decorative. Each symbol had meaning within criminal culture, announcing his rank and supposed accomplishments to anyone who could read them. When Besik finished his sentence for the Krasnogorsk burglary and was scheduled for release in June 2020, investigators were ready. Instead of freedom, he was immediately arrested and transferred to CISO 1 in Saratov to face charges under Article 210.1. The maximum penalty was 15 years in a maximum security colony, plus a 5 million ruble fine. For someone who had spent most of his adult life in prison, the prospect of potentially 15 more years must have been terrifying. He was 37 years old. 15 years would take him past 50. By the time he got out, if he got out, he'd be an old man. Faced with this reality, Besik made a decision that shocked both prosecutors and the criminal world. In June 2020, during a court hearing in Oktyabrski District Court of Saratov, he and his lawyers filed a complaint challenging the very initiation of criminal proceedings against him. Their argument was simple but stunning. Besik Kvinikidze was not currently a thief-in-law. Therefore, he couldn't be charged under a law that criminalized occupying the highest position in criminal hierarchy. After spending years fighting for recognition, after lying and scheming and broadcasting audio messages about his restored status, Besik now stood in court and claimed he had no such status at all. The court hearing revealed the fundamental emptiness of his character. This was a man who would claim to be a thief-in-law when it benefited him, to collect money, command respect, exercise power over other inmates, but would instantly deny that same status when it became legally convenient. The supposed code he claimed to live by, the traditions he supposedly honored, the criminal identity he'd spent his entire adult life cultivating, all of it evaporated the moment he faced real consequences. His willingness to renounce everything he'd claimed to stand for just to avoid prison time demonstrated that he'd never really believed in any of it. The court wasn't buying it. Prosecutors presented their evidence methodically. They showed that Besik had been formally crowned as a thief-in-law in June 2013. They documented his activities from April 2019 to September 2020, demonstrating that he consistently acted as someone occupying the highest position in criminal hierarchy. They presented his tattoos as physical evidence permanently marked on his body. They brought forward witnesses who testified that he collected tribute, settled disputes, and gave orders based on his claimed authority. The evidence was so comprehensive that Besik's courtroom denial of his status seemed almost delusional. On June 23, 2020, the Saratov Regional Court denied his complaint. The judges ruled that investigators and prosecutors had presented sufficient evidence to justify charging him under Article 210.1. His measure of restraint, pretrial detention, was left unchanged. He would remain in custody until August 9, 2020, and likely far beyond as the case proceeded to trial. The court had essentially called his bluff. You can't spend years claiming to be a thief-in-law, backing up that claim with actions and symbols, and then expect courts to believe you were just pretending when prosecution comes. But the legal proceedings were only beginning. Over the following months, as his case slowly wound through the Russian justice system, more details emerged about exactly what he'd been doing in prison. Prosecutors painted a detailed picture of Besik's operations inside Colony No. 7 in Saratov region. This wasn't just theoretical authority. He was running a protection racket and power structure within the prison walls. Testimony revealed that he systematically collected money from other inmates, presenting it as contributions to the thieves' common fund, the Obshchak. In theory, this fund is supposed to support imprisoned criminals and their families, pay for legal defense, and maintain the infrastructure of the criminal world. In practice, it's often just extortion with a traditional veneer. The money Besik collected didn't stay in the colony. Through various smuggling methods, corrupt guards, visits from accomplices, hidden in packages, funds were transferred outside the prison walls to support criminal world representatives in the region. This created a financial pipeline connecting imprisoned criminals to those operating on the outside, ensuring the continuity of criminal operations despite incarceration. Every ruble collected reinforced the parallel power structure that exists within Russia's prison system, where official administration competes with informal criminal hierarchy for actual control. Witness after witness confirmed the same pattern. Besik would identify newly arrived inmates and assess their financial situation. Those with resources, families who could send money, businesses on the outside, savings they'd hidden before arrest, were expected to contribute. The amounts varied based on perceived ability to pay, but refusing wasn't really an option. Inmates who resisted faced social isolation, physical threats, or being designated as lower in the criminal hierarchy, which could make their daily prison life unbearable. Those who cooperated earned protection and better treatment within the inmate power structure. But Besik's influence went beyond mere financial extraction. He actively worked to undermine prison administration's authority. When guards gave orders that conflicted with his instructions, he encouraged inmates to refuse compliance. When administration tried to implement new rules or procedures, he organized resistance. This wasn't principled civil disobedience against genuine abuse. It was systematic destabilization designed to maintain criminal power within the facility. Every act of defiance he orchestrated weakened official authority and strengthened his own position. The prosecution presented evidence that Besik designated certain inmates as smotrieshchi, watchers or overseers, who would manage criminal affairs in specific sections of the colony. These weren't official positions recognized by prison administration, but rather appointments within the shadow hierarchy. A smotrieshchi acted as Besik's representative, collecting money, settling minor disputes, enforcing rules, and reporting back on developments. This created a management structure that mirrored legitimate organizational hierarchies, except it existed to facilitate criminal control rather than rehabilitation or justice. He also ruled on who among the inmates could be considered proper criminals versus those who were lower or outcasts. In Russian prison culture, certain categories of people are automatically deemed untouchable: child molesters, rapists, informants. But Besik went beyond these traditional exclusions, using his supposed authority to socially elevate or destroy inmates based on personal whims, political considerations, or financial incentives. An inmate could go from respected to ostracized overnight if Besik decided they'd shown disrespect or failed to contribute adequately. The tattoos covering his body became key evidence at trial. Each design wasn't just decoration, but a form of criminal resume readable to anyone familiar with prison symbolism. Stars on the shoulders indicated high criminal rank. Cathedrals with spires showed years served in prison. Certain religious imagery signified adherence to thieves' traditions. Prosecutors brought in experts who decoded these symbols for the court, explaining how each one represented a claim about his status, his accomplishments, his identity within the criminal world. Besik had literally marked his body with permanent evidence of the very status he was now denying. Particularly damning was testimony about specific incidents where Besik exercised his supposed authority. In one case, 2 inmates got into a serious dispute over debt. Rather than letting prison administration handle it through official channels, the inmates brought their complaint to Besik. He heard both sides, made a ruling about who owed what, and enforced his decision through threat of social consequences. This kind of alternative dispute resolution might sound benign, but it fundamentally undermined the rule of law within the prison, replacing it with the arbitrary judgment of someone claiming criminal authority. In another incident, an inmate was accused by others of cooperating with guards, of being a rat who provided information to administration. Such accusations are incredibly serious in prison culture and can lead to violence or even death. Besik held what amounted to a trial, examining evidence and testimony from other inmates, then rendered a verdict. The accused was deemed guilty and designated as lower status, condemned to social isolation and constant harassment. Whether the accusation was even true didn't matter. What mattered was that Besik had exercised life-altering power over another human being based solely on his claimed criminal authority. The prosecution also demonstrated that Besik knew perfectly well that his actions were criminal. Article 210.1 had been introduced in April 2019 with significant publicity. Media covered it extensively. Prison administration posted notices informing inmates of the new law. There was no way someone actively involved in the criminal world, paying attention to legal developments that directly affected him, could claim ignorance. He knew that occupying the position of thief-in-law was now specifically criminalized. He knew the penalties. And he continued anyway, apparently believing he wouldn't get caught, or that his status protected him somehow. Throughout the trial, which stretched over months, Besik's defense team tried various strategies. They challenged the legitimacy of witness testimony, arguing that inmates might have grudges or be seeking favor with prosecution. They questioned whether the evidence really proved he occupied the highest position as the law specified. Maybe he was just influential, not technically at the very top. They argued that his discoronation in 2019 meant he legally couldn't be considered a thief-in-law during the period prosecutors were targeting. None of these arguments gained significant traction. The trial also revealed uncomfortable truths about Russia's prison system. The fact that one inmate could exercise this much power, collect this much money, and run this extensive an operation within a supposedly secure facility raised obvious questions about corruption and administrative failure. How were mobile phones getting into the prison for those audio messages? How was money being smuggled out? Why weren't guards preventing the formation of this parallel power structure? The answers suggested that some prison officials were complicit, either through bribery or simply turning a blind eye to maintain a fragile peace. On November 30th, 2021, after extensive proceedings, the Saratov Regional Court delivered its verdict. Besik Kvinikidze was found guilty under Article 210.1 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation, occupying the highest position in criminal hierarchy. The court determined that, despite his claims to the contrary, he had indeed held and exercised authority as a thief-in-law from April 2019 through September 8, 2020. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern undeniable, and his courtroom denials, unconvincing given his documented behavior. The sentence was 8 years imprisonment in a special regime colony, the highest security level in the Russian prison system, reserved for the most dangerous criminals and those who have committed serious crimes multiple times. Additionally, he received 2 years of restricted freedom to follow after his release, meaning he would face limitations on movement and activities even after serving his full term. While 8 years was less than the maximum 15 the law allowed, it was still a substantial sentence that would take him well into middle age. At 39 years old at the time of sentencing, Besik would be at least 47 when released, assuming no additional charges or violations extended his term. Given his history of immediately returning to criminal activity after each release, the restricted freedom conditions following his imprisonment made sense. Authorities clearly anticipated he would need monitoring. December 5, 2021 saw the formal announcement of the sentence, and Besik was transferred to begin serving his time in a special regime facility. The special regime colonies are notably harsher than standard prisons. Inmates face stricter supervision, fewer privileges, more limited contact with the outside world, and generally brutal conditions designed for Russia's most dangerous criminals. For someone accustomed to exercising power and authority, even in prison, the special regime environment would be humbling. Here, attempting to run criminal operations or claim thief-in-law status would be far more difficult and dangerous. Guards in these facilities have seen everything and tend to respond harshly to inmates who try to establish parallel authority structures. The criminal world's reaction to Besik's conviction and his courtroom behavior was largely contemptuous. The fact that he'd renounced his status when facing prosecution confirmed what many had suspected all along. He'd never really internalized the supposed code he claimed to follow. A genuine thief-in-law, according to the mythology, would accept punishment for his status as the cost of maintaining principles. Besik's willingness to immediately deny everything to save himself destroyed whatever remained of his credibility. Even criminals who might have sympathized with his plight couldn't respect someone so transparently opportunistic. Online forums where criminal world developments are discussed lit up with commentary. Some mocked him for getting caught stealing cognac from a grandmother. Others focused on his courtroom denial of status. A few pointed out the delicious irony of someone who spent years lying to achieve criminal authority now being punished specifically for that authority. The consensus was that Besik represented everything wrong with the modern criminal world. People pursuing status and power without genuine commitment to any principles, however twisted those principles might be. His case also became significant in legal circles. As one of the first major convictions under Article 210.1 in Saratov region, it set precedents for how prosecutors could use the law. The fact that courts accepted tattoos as evidence of criminal status was particularly notable. The reliance on inmate testimony, despite obvious credibility concerns, showed that prosecutors could build cases even without direct physical evidence of specific criminal acts. Future cases against thieves-in-law would likely follow similar patterns: document the exercise of authority, find witnesses willing to testify, use symbols and communications as evidence, prove knowledge that the behavior was illegal. Interestingly, Besik's case was the second conviction under Article 210.1 in Saratov region that year. Earlier in 2021, Sergei Asatryan, known as Osetrina Jr., had received a similar sentence. Asatryan was already serving time for extortion when additional charges were brought under the new law. The fact that Saratov prosecutors were aggressively using this legislation suggested a coordinated campaign against criminal hierarchies in the region. Other thieves-in-law and aspiring criminal authorities would have to consider whether maintaining their status was worth the risk of lengthy special regime sentences. The conviction also highlighted tensions between traditional criminal culture and modern reality. The thieves-in-law tradition emerged in Stalin-era labor camps under specific historical conditions. The code developed as a way for certain prisoners to maintain identity and resistance against a totalitarian state. But in contemporary Russia, with its different political system, different prison conditions, and different social context, much of that tradition had become hollow performance. People like Besik went through the motions, getting the tattoos, using the jargon, claiming the status, without any genuine connection to whatever principles might have originally animated the tradition. His biography reads like a case study in the gap between criminal mythology and sordid reality. The romantic image of thieves-in-law portrays them as honorable outlaws following a strict code, commanding respect through charisma and principle. The reality of Besik's life showed petty theft, constant lying, stealing credit for others' accomplishments, terrorizing fellow inmates for pocket change, and immediate betrayal of everything he claimed to believe in when faced with consequences. There was nothing honorable, nothing principled, nothing worthy of respect in any of it. The pattern of his criminal career also revealed a stunning lack of learning or adaptation. Most criminals, even career criminals, eventually develop some sophistication. They learn from mistakes, adjust strategies, find more lucrative and less risky operations. Besik, despite spending most of his adult life in prison, never evolved beyond small-time theft and prison rackets. At 34, supposedly a thief-in-law, he was still breaking into apartments to steal bottles of cognac. The disconnect between his pretensions and his capabilities would be comedic if the human cost weren't so real. Consider the victims in his story. The 75-year-old woman in Krasnogorsk whose home he ransacked. She had to deal with the violation and fear that comes with burglary, all so he could steal items worth less than $500. The inmates he extorted in prison, many serving time for relatively minor offenses, who had to choose between giving up limited resources or facing harassment and isolation. The families of inmates who sent money thinking it was going to help their imprisoned relatives, not knowing it was being diverted to criminal operations. The guards and administrators trying to maintain order who faced coordinated resistance. None of these people were criminal rivals or enemy combatants. They were just ordinary people harmed by his decisions. His father's influence looms large in understanding how he ended up this way. Growing up as the son of a criminal authority, Besik was essentially programmed from birth for this life. He never had a chance to develop legitimate aspirations or see alternative paths. The tragedy is that being born into a criminal family doesn't predetermine outcomes. Plenty of people from similar backgrounds reject that path and build legitimate lives. Besik, whether through lack of imagination, lack of courage, or genuine conviction, simply followed the trajectory set by his father. He inherited a legacy of crime and never questioned whether it was worth inheriting. The name he chose for his criminal identity, Beso Rustavsky, is itself revealing. Rustavsky references Rustavi, a city in Georgia, linking him to Georgian criminal traditions that have been particularly influential in Soviet and post-Soviet criminal culture. By taking this name, he was claiming connection to a specific criminal lineage and geography. But, like everything else about his criminal persona, it was more costume than substance. He was from Yakutia, not Georgia. His authority came from deception, not legitimate recognition. The name was just another layer of pretense on top of an already fraudulent identity. Where is Beso Rustavsky now? As of 2024, he remains imprisoned in a special regime colony, serving his 8-year sentence that began in late 2021. Assuming standard release calculations and no additional charges or violations, he would be eligible for release around 2029, when he'll be approximately 47 years old. The 2 additional years of restricted freedom would extend until around 2031, when he'd be approaching 50. What happens then is predictable based on his history, either another arrest for new crimes or an attempt to rebuild some kind of criminal status, or possibly just quiet obscurity as an aging ex-convict with nothing to show for decades of criminal activity. The broader significance of his story extends beyond one man's failures. It illuminates how organized crime actually functions in Russia, the role of prisons as criminal networking hubs, the gap between mythologized criminal traditions and grubby reality, and the challenge law enforcement faces in disrupting criminal hierarchies. The introduction of Article 210.1 represents a strategic shift. Instead of just prosecuting individual crimes, Russian authorities are trying to criminalize the structural positions that enable ongoing criminal operations. Whether this approach will be effective remains to be seen, but cases like Besik's suggest it can at least disrupt operations and force criminal authorities to operate more cautiously. It also demonstrates the performative nature of much criminal culture. The tattoos, the jargon, the supposed code, the formal coronations. All of it creates an elaborate theater of criminal identity. For some participants, this theater becomes reality, genuinely shaping their behavior and decisions. For others, like Besik, it's always been just performance, a useful fiction maintained as long as it provides benefits, but abandoned immediately when it becomes costly. His willingness to renounce his thief-in-law status in court revealed that all the symbols and rituals meant nothing compared to avoiding prison time. The question of why someone would pursue criminal authority this aggressively, given the obvious costs, has no simple answer. Part of it is certainly the family influence and early environment that normalized crime as a career path. Part is the status and power that come with being recognized as a thief-in-law, however hollow that recognition might be. Part is probably the absence of alternative paths. Someone with Besik's criminal record couldn't easily transition to legitimate work even if he wanted to. And part might be a psychological need for significance, for recognition, for mattering in some context, even if that context is the criminal underworld. What's clear is that the pursuit destroyed his life. By age 40, he'd spent more time in prison than out. He had no legitimate accomplishments, no family life, no real wealth, despite years of criminal activity, no genuine friendships or loyalty from supposed allies. The status he fought so hard to achieve was stripped away twice, and the second time, he voluntarily renounced it to save himself. The code he claimed to follow revealed itself as meaningless performance. The authority he exercised was limited to terrorizing fellow prisoners who couldn't escape his demands. This is what his criminal career produced, nothing but waste and harm. His story serves as a useful corrective to romanticized portrayals of organized crime. There's no glamour here, no clever heists, no strategic brilliance, no honor among thieves. Just a man born into a criminal family who followed that path with diminishing returns, accumulating convictions and prison time without ever achieving anything meaningful, even by criminal standards. The supposed thief-in-law ended his career stealing cognac from grandmothers and lying about other people's accomplishments. If this is what the highest position in criminal hierarchy looks like, it's a hierarchy worth destroying. The Russian government's campaign against thieves-in-law, exemplified by laws like Article 210.1, faces legitimate criticism around due process and potential abuse. Laws that criminalize status rather than specific acts can be dangerous tools that might be used against political opponents or other targets beyond their stated purpose. But cases like Besik's demonstrate why authorities felt such laws were necessary. Traditional prosecution methods weren't effectively disrupting criminal power structures. Thieves-in-law could orchestrate crimes while maintaining distance from direct involvement, making convictions difficult. A law targeting the position itself, backed by evidence of exercising that authority, provided a new tool for dismantling criminal hierarchies. Whether this approach will ultimately succeed in reducing organized crime is questionable. Criminal organizations adapt to new pressures, finding different structures and methods. Eliminating the formal thief-in-law system might just push criminal authority underground or into new forms that are harder to identify and prosecute. But, at minimum, it's disrupted the traditional system and forced criminals to operate with more caution about claiming such status. People watching cases like Besik's conviction must calculate whether maintaining visible criminal authority is worth risking 8 to 15 years in special regime colonies. The human capacity for self-deception is one of the story's recurring themes. Besik apparently believed, or convinced himself he believed, that he could lie his way to legitimate criminal authority. He thought concealing the Butyrka incident would never catch up with him. He thought claiming credit for Irakli Danelia's accomplishments would go unquestioned. He thought broadcasting audio messages about his restored status wouldn't create problems. At each stage, reality contradicted his assumptions, yet he kept making similar miscalculations. This wasn't stupidity. He clearly had some cunning, but rather an inability or unwillingness to accurately assess situations and adjust behavior accordingly. Perhaps the final irony is that if Besik had simply been honest from the beginning, he might have achieved the status he craved. If he'd admitted the Butyrka incident when seeking coronation, explained what happened and how he'd addressed it, some authorities might have accepted that. If he'd patiently worked to resolve the conflict with Guja Kutaisi instead of trying to hide it, he might have earned genuine reinstatement after his discoronation. If he'd stuck to more sophisticated crimes instead of petty burglaries, he might have commanded more respect. But honesty, patience, and restraint weren't in his character. The very qualities that might have made him successful as a criminal were the ones he lacked entirely. His legacy, such as it is, amounts to a cautionary tale. Within the criminal world, his name has become synonymous with fraudulence and failure. In legal circles, his case serves as precedent for prosecuting criminal hierarchy under Article 210.1. In broader society, he's either unknown or remembered as the thief-in-law who stole cognac from a grandmother, a punchline more than a genuine threat. For someone who spent his entire adult life pursuing criminal authority and recognition, this legacy represents total failure. The crown he desperately wanted was always fool's gold, and now even that illusion is gone. As Besik Kvinikidze sits in his special regime colony, approaching middle age with years of imprisonment still ahead, one wonders if he reflects on his choices. Does he recognize the pattern of self-destructive behavior, the lies that poisoned every achievement? Does he take responsibility for the harm he caused to victims and the waste he made of his own life? Or does he still see himself as somehow victimized by circumstances, by rivals who exposed him, by laws designed to target people like him? The answer probably doesn't matter. Whether he achieves insight or remains delusional, the outcome is the same. Years in brutal prison conditions, followed by restricted freedom, followed by whatever diminished existence awaits an aging ex-convict with nothing but a lengthy criminal record. The story of Beso Rustavsky ultimately isn't about organized crime or Russian prisons or thieves-in-law traditions. It's about the human cost of pursuing false status through destructive means. It's about the inevitable consequences of building authority on lies. It's about the gap between aspirations and capabilities, between mythology and reality, between what someone wants to be and what they actually are. Besik Kvinikidze wanted to be a respected criminal authority, a thief-in-law, commanding genuine loyalty and fear. Instead, he became a petty criminal too dishonest even for the criminal world to accept, whose greatest notoriety comes from stealing alcohol from an elderly woman. That's not a legacy worth pursuing, but it's the one he built through years of bad decisions, each compounding the last, until nothing remained but wreckage and wasted years.